Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Gerald Patterson laughed as he flicked a glob of expensive caviar onto Summer's sensible nursing shoes in front of the entire gala committee. The dark, salty beads slid down the scuffed leather, a stark contrast to the pristine white. He didn't look away, his eyes crinkling with a cruel sort of delight that usually preceded a public execution of someone's dignity. "Oops," he said, though his voice lacked even a tremor of sincerity. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, the ice clinking like a funeral knell. "I suppose that's more than you make in a week, isn't it, Summer? You should probably lick it off. It's a waste of good money, and God knows this family has spent enough of that on you." The grand foyer of the Patterson estate smelled of lilies and wood smoke, a scent Summer usually found comforting. Tonight, it was suffocating. She stood there, her shoulders aching from a double shift in the ICU, the fluorescent hum of the hospital still ringing in her ears. She had rushed here, skipping dinner and a shower, because Linda had insisted the family needed to be unified for Gerald's 65th birthday. "Gerald, don't be so dramatic," Linda Patterson said, though she was busy smoothing the silk of her emerald gown, her eyes never meeting Summer's. She adjusted a diamond brooch that cost more than a year of Summer's rent. "She's just a bit unkempt. It's the profession she chose. Someone has to do the dirty work, I suppose." From the sweeping staircase, a sharp camera flash blinded Summer. Brianna Patterson stood on the third step, her phone held high, her face illuminated by the ring light she carried everywhere. "Oh, stay right there, Summer," Brianna chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "My followers are going to love this. The prodigal daughter returns in her peasant rags. It's so authentic, very poverty-core." Summer felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, a slow-burning embers of a rage she had kept dampened for a decade. She looked down at the caviar on her shoe. She thought of the patient she had lost 4 hours ago, a grandfather who had held her hand and thanked her for being kind. Then she looked at the man who had raised her, a man whose only contribution to the world was a name on a board of directors he no longer sat on. "I came here to wish you a happy birthday, Gerald," Summer said, her voice surprisingly steady. She didn't use the word dad. She hadn't felt like his daughter since the day she'd chosen nursing over the decorative life he'd mapped out for her. "You came here to remind me of my failures," Gerald snapped, his face reddening as he took a heavy step toward her. The scent of aged bourbon rolled off him in waves. "Look at you. You smell like antiseptic and failure. You're a Patterson, yet you spend your days cleaning up after people who can't afford to breathe without a machine. It's an embarrassment." He turned to the committee members, 3 men in tailored tuxedos who were watching the exchange with varying degrees of awkwardness and amusement. "This is what happens when you don't discipline your children. They end up in scrubs, thinking they're martyrs because they know how to change a catheter." One of the men chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. Aunt Dorothy stood near the buffet table, her hands trembling as she clutched a lace handkerchief. She caught Summer's eye for a fleeting second, a look of profound apology and something else, fear, crossing her weathered face before she looked away. Summer reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool glass screen of her phone. It vibrated. A message from Marcus Whitfield. "The audit is complete. You were right about the offshore transfers. Say the word." She felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. It was the same feeling she got right before a code blew, the moment where emotion died and strategy took over. "You're right, Gerald," Summer said, her voice dropping an octave. The room went strangely quiet. Even Brianna lowered her phone, sensing a shift in the wind. "Money is a very important thing in this house. It seems to be the only thing that keeps the walls standing." Gerald sneered, stepping closer until he was inches from her face. "It's the only thing that matters, girl. And since you have none, you have no voice here. Now, go to the kitchen and see if you can help the caterers. At least then you'll be doing something useful." Linda stepped forward, finally looking at Summer. Her expression wasn't one of motherly concern, but of a predator guarding its territory. "Go on, Summer. Don't ruin the evening. You've already made enough of a scene with those shoes." Summer didn't move. She felt the weight of the secret she had been carrying for months, a weight that was starting to feel like a weapon. She thought of the bank statements Aunt Dorothy had slipped her weeks ago, the ones showing how Gerald had been systematically draining the Patterson trust to fund his gambling debts, all while pretending to be the benevolent patriarch. But more than that, she thought of the document Marcus had sent her this morning, the one that proved the Patterson estate wasn't even Gerald's anymore. He had put it up as collateral 3 years ago, and the person who had quietly bought the debt through a series of anonymous shells wasn't a bank. It was her. "I'll go," Summer said, a small, tight smile touching her lips. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But before I do, I think you should check your email, Gerald. There's a notice from the holding company regarding the property taxes. It seems there's been a change in management." Gerald froze, his glass hovering halfway to his mouth. "What are you talking about?" "Just a bit of dirty work I handled on my break," Summer replied. She turned on her heel, the caviar-stained shoe clicking sharply against the marble. "Summer," Linda called out, her voice rising in pitch. "Where are you going? We aren't finished with you." Summer didn't look back. She walked toward the grand oak doors, the heavy scent of lilies finally fading as she reached the cool night air. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped a single button. "Marcus," she said into the receiver as she stepped into the driveway. "Start the proceedings, and make sure the eviction notice is served at the end of the party. I want them to have one last night in their house." She climbed into her modest sedan, the engine turning over with a reliable hum. Behind her, the lights of the Patterson estate blazed, a golden cage that was about to disappear. As she drove away, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a storm. The countdown had begun. 2 weeks until the annual Patterson Foundation Gala. 2 weeks until the world found out who really owned the chair at the head of the table. The next morning, the sterile scent of antiseptic and industrial-grade lavender offered a grounding comfort that the Patterson estate never could. Summer Patterson checked the vitals on a patient in the cardiac wing, her movements precise and practiced. She had spent years mastering the art of being invisible while being essential, a skill honed in a house that treated her like a piece of furniture that occasionally performed chores. Here, in her scrubs, she wasn't the charity case or the disappointing daughter. She was the person who kept hearts beating. The double doors of the intensive care unit swung open with a jarring, metallic bang. Gerald Patterson strode in, his tailored charcoal suit a loud, expensive intrusion in the hushed ward. Beside him, Linda Patterson clutched a designer handbag like a shield, her eyes darting around the linoleum floors with thinly veiled disgust. They looked like royalty visiting the slums, and they wanted everyone within earshot to know it. "There she is," Gerald announced, his voice booming and echoing off the glass partitions. Playing martyr among the sick instead of answering her phone. Summer didn't look up from her tablet. She finished logging the heart rate before turning to face them. "You're not allowed back here without a visitor's pass, Gerald. This is a restricted area." "Pass," he scoffed, stepping into her personal space. The heavy, cloying scent of his sandalwood cologne fought the clinical air, making her stomach turn. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "I don't need a permission slip to talk to my own daughter. You walked out last night like a common thief. You left your mother in tears and your sister without her car keys. Do you have any idea how that looks?" "I'm at work," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her voice was a flat, icy line that didn't tremble. "If you have a medical emergency, stay. Otherwise, leave." Brianna Patterson appeared from behind a pillar, her phone already mounted on a sleek silver gimbal. "Oh my God, guys," she whispered into the wireless microphone clipped to her lapel, ignoring the no filming signs. "Look at the conditions Summer works in. It's so brave, so gritty. She's literally ignoring her own family to play nurse." She turned the camera toward a bed-bound patient in the corner, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of viral sympathy. "Put that away, Brianna," Summer snapped, her patience finally fraying. "That's a HIPAA violation and a gross invasion of privacy. Don't use those technicalities to hide from us," Linda spat, her voice rising in pitch. We've been talking, Summer. We're done with this little hobby of yours. Your father has friends on the board of this hospital. One call and you're back at the house where you belong, serving our guests for the gala. You think you're so capable, but you're only here because we allowed it. Gerald smirked, adjusting his gold Rolex so the overhead fluorescent lights caught the diamonds. Consider this your final warning. You have 13 days to fix your attitude. If you aren't standing by our side at the Patterson Foundation Gala, smiling for the donors and playing the grateful ward, you'll never work in this city again. I'll make sure your capability is recognized as the fraud it is. I can ruin you with a single lunch meeting. 2 other nurses paused at the station, their eyes wide as they witnessed the head of the Patterson family berating one of their own. The humiliation was calculated, a public stripping of her professional dignity. After security finally escorted them out, Gerald shouting about lawsuits and his significant donations, the entire way Summer retreated to the break room. Her hands were steady as she pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from her locker. It had been delivered by a private courier from Aunt Dorothy just an hour before her shift started. Inside weren't just bank statements. They were the original articles of incorporation for the Patterson Foundation, along with a set of property deeds that had been buried in a safe deposit box for 20 years. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Marcus Whitfield's name flashed on the screen. I saw the security footage from the lobby, Marcus said, his voice deep and resonant with a protective edge. I can have them barred from the premises permanently. I can have Gerald's donations returned with a cease and desist by noon. Summer looked at the date on the wall calendar. The gala was circled in red, a ticking clock in the center of her life. No, not yet. Let them keep believing they're the ones holding the leash. I want them to spend every last cent they think they have on that party. I want the guest list to be perfect. And the eviction notice for the estate, Marcus asked. The paperwork is ready, Summer replied, her thumb tracing the embossed seal on the documents in her lap. They think they can take my career because they own the board. They don't realize that by the time the gala starts, you and I will own the board, the building, and the very ground they're standing on. She hung up and looked at her reflection in the darkened break room window. The sleeping lion wasn't just a metaphor anymore. She was the storm, and the countdown had officially hit 12 days. Behind her, the hospital hummed with life, a life she was about to reclaim entirely. 48 hours later, the scent of dust and peppermint tea filled Aunt Dorothy's cramped apartment. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, high-tech corridors of the hospital or the sprawling, cold luxury of the Patterson estate. Summer sat on a faded velvet armchair, her back straight, watching as her aunt's trembling hands fumbled with a loose floorboard beneath an antique china cabinet. Your mother, my sister, is a clever woman, Summer, Dorothy whispered, her voice thin and brittle. But she was always greedy. She thought I was too soft to notice what she was doing when your father passed. She didn't think I'd keep the originals. With a soft grunt of effort, she pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger and a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. The yellowed, brittle edges of the paper crinkled as she handed them over. Summer felt a jolt of electricity travel up her arms as her fingers brushed the documents. This was it. The physical proof of the financial rot at the heart of the Patterson family. The trust wasn't just for the business, Dorothy continued, her eyes watering. It was for you. Marcus Whitfield had set up a secondary fund for your education and your future, independent of Gerald. Linda intercepted the bank notifications. She forged your signature for a decade, funneling that money into Brianna's influencer, lifestyle, and Gerald's failing investments. Summer opened the envelope. There in black and white were the original deeds to the Patterson estate. Her heart skipped a beat. The house didn't belong to Gerald. It never had. It was held in a trust that matured on Summer's 25th birthday, a date that had passed 6 months ago. Gerald and Linda weren't just living in her childhood home. They were squatting in a property that legally belonged to the woman they treated like a servant. Thank you, Dorothy, Summer said, her voice low and steady. She tucked the envelope into her bag, feeling the heavy, metallic weight of the truth. You have no idea how much this changes everything. Just be careful, her aunt warned. They've spent years building a lie. They won't let it go without a fight. I'm not looking for a fight, she replied, a cold smile touching her lips. I'm looking for an eviction. By the afternoon, the quiet resolve of the morning was tested by the sharp, clinical sting of antiseptic as she began her shift at the hospital. She was adjusting an IV drip for a patient in room 402 when the heavy thud of heels and the screech of expensive Italian leather loafers on the linoleum announced a familiar presence. Gerald Patterson marched into the ICU, flanked by Linda. He looked absurdly out of place in his tailored charcoal suit, his gold signet ring catching the harsh fluorescent light as he gestured wildly. He wasn't there to see a patient. He was there to exert his perceived dominance. "There she is," Gerald barked, loud enough for the nurses at the central station to turn their heads. "The girl who thinks she can ignore her family's phone calls." Summer didn't turn around immediately. She finished securing the line, her movements methodical and calm. Only when the task was done did she face them. "This is a restricted area, Gerald. You're disturbing the patients." "I'm a donor to this hospital," he sneered, stepping into her personal space. The smell of his expensive, cloying cologne filled the air. "I go where I want, and right now I want you to listen. We're hosting the gala in 10 days. Brianna needs the guest list from the Whitfield account, and since you're so close with the administration here, you're going to get it for us." Linda stepped forward, her eyes scanning Summer's simple blue scrubs with visible revulsion. "Look at you, scrubbing floors and changing bags. It's embarrassing, Summer. We've told everyone you're a medical consultant, but if you don't start acting like a daughter who owes us, we might just have to tell the truth about your lackluster performance in the family." "My performance?" Summer asked, her voice like ice. "Don't get smart with me," Gerald snapped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled coffee cup he'd clearly finished in the lobby, thrusting it toward her. "Here, since you're already in the habit of cleaning up after people, make yourself useful. It's the only thing you're actually qualified for." A few of the younger nurses gasped. Dr. Rebecca Chen, standing 10 feet away, froze with a chart in her hand, her eyes narrowed at the display of raw arrogance. Summer looked at the cup, then up at Gerald's flushed, entitled face. She didn't take it. Instead, she let it drop from his hand, the few remaining drops of brown liquid splashing onto his polished shoes. "Oops," she said softly, echoing the exact tone Linda had used when she'd accidentally ruined Summer's dress years ago. Gerald's face went from a dull red to a deep, dangerous purple. The gala is in 10 days, Gerald," she interrupted, her voice carrying a terrifying weight of certainty. "I suggest you spend that time making sure the house is spotless. You'll want it to look perfect for the new owners." "What are you talking about?" Linda demanded, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "We own that house. We own everything." "Enjoy the delusion while it lasts," she replied, stepping around them as if they were nothing more than obstacles in the hallway. "And Gerald, pick up your trash. This is a place of healing, not a dumping ground for has-beens." She walked away without looking back, her heart drumming a steady, rhythmic beat of anticipation. She could feel their eyes burning into her back, hear Gerald's muffled roars of indignation as security finally approached them. Later that night, sat in her car in the darkened parking lot, Summer pulled out her phone. She looked at the digital countdown Marcus had sent her. 240 hours. She touched the manila envelope on the passenger seat. The deeds were signed. The audit was complete. The Pattersons were planning a party to celebrate their status, unaware that they were actually planning their own funeral. She dialed Marcus's number. "It's done. I have the physical copies of the trust." "And the gala?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding like a predator waiting in the tall grass. "Tell the board to be there in full evening dress," Summer said, her eyes fixed on the hospital's glowing sign. "They wanted a show. I'm going to give them a masterpiece." She hung up and gripped the steering wheel. 2 days until the final filings were processed. 10 days until the world fell out from under Gerald Patterson's feet. She wasn't just a ghost in the corner anymore. She was the one holding the keys to the house, the business, and their very survival. And she wasn't planning on letting them keep a single thing. The following evening, the scent of expensive cedar and aged bourbon hung heavy in the private dining room of the Gilded Prime. Summer Patterson sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her posture straight, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality. Across from her, Gerald Patterson was already on his third glass of scotch, his face flushed with the kind of triumph that only comes from thinking you've successfully robbed someone who can't fight back. "To the new expansion," Gerald said, raising his glass to the room. Linda Patterson and Brianna Patterson cheered, their voices echoing off the velvet-lined walls. He didn't even look at Summer as he spoke. "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you stop letting sentimentality get in the way of business. We're finally trimming the fat." Summer felt the heavy, cold weight of the silver butter knife in her hand. She didn't flinch when Gerald turned his predatory gaze toward her. "You look like you've been scrubbing floors all day, Summer," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the waiter to pause by the door. "Maybe if you spent less time playing martyr at that hospital and more time learning how to dress for a 5-star meal, I wouldn't feel so embarrassed to have you at the table. That dress looks like it came from a clearance rack at a funeral home." Brianna giggled, her phone already out to capture the moment. "Oh, Dad, don't be mean. She's an essential worker. Someone has to empty the bedpans while we're running the empire." She pointed her camera at Summer, the flash a brief, blinding intrusion. "Say poverty, Summer. It's your best look." Summer didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at Linda, who was busy admiring a new diamond tennis bracelet that had undoubtedly been purchased with funds diverted from the hospital trust. Instead, she looked directly at Gerald. The sharp, medicinal scent of his expensive cologne wafted toward her, cloying and suffocating. "The audit is finished, Gerald," Summer said, her voice a calm, low vibration that cut through the laughter. Gerald froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He let out a wet, arrogant laugh that lacked any real humor. "The audit? You think your little nursing degree gives you the right to talk about my business? I've had the best accountants in the city looking at those books for a decade. You wouldn't know a deficit from a dividend if it hit you in the face." "I'm not talking about your business," she replied, her eyes never wavering. "I'm talking about the trust, my father's trust. You might want to check the liquidity of those accounts before you sign the final contracts for the expansion tomorrow morning. Some things are built on sand, and the tide is coming in much faster than you think." The table went silent for a heartbeat. Aunt Dorothy, sitting beside Linda, gripped her wine glass so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at Summer with a mixture of terror and realization, her eyes darting toward the manila envelope Summer had left visible in the side pocket of her bag. "Are you threatening me?" Gerald's voice dropped an octave, the entitlement radiating off him in waves. He leaned over the table, invading her space. "You're a guest in this family by the grace of my wife's pity. You have nothing. No standing, no power, and certainly no money. If I hear one more word about audits or trusts, I'll have you blacklisted from every medical facility in this state. Do you understand me?" Summer didn't pull back. She felt the vibration of her phone in her lap. A text from Marcus Whitfield confirming the filings were ready for the 8:00 a.m. deadline. She reached into her clutch and touched the cool, smooth surface of a digital drive, her secret power humming beneath her fingertips. "I understand perfectly," she said, standing up and smoothing her navy blue dress. "I just thought I'd give you the chance to be honest before the world does it for you. Enjoy the steak, Gerald. It's the last one you won't have to work for." "Sit down," Linda hissed, her face contorting in rage. "You don't walk away from this table until your father says so." "He isn't my father," Summer said, looking at the woman who had spent 10 years trying to erase her existence. "And the table doesn't belong to him anymore." She walked out of the room, the sound of her heels steady on the marble floor. Behind her, she heard Gerald shouting for the waiter, his voice booming with a desperate, shaky authority. He was still laughing, still dismissing her as a nuisance, unaware that the countdown had already reached its final hours. Outside, the night air was biting and crisp. Summer pulled her coat tight, her eyes fixed on the glowing hospital sign in the distance. 12 hours until the filings hit the court. 14 hours until the board meeting. She wasn't just a ghost in the corner anymore. She was the storm, and Gerald Patterson had just closed his eyes and hoped the wind wouldn't blow. The following evening, the ballroom of the Whitfield Grand Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and practiced smiles. The scent of 1,000 lilies hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp, expensive sting of vintage champagne. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured light over the city's elite, but for Gerald Patterson, the glow felt like a personal spotlight. He stood near the mahogany bar, smoothing the lapels of a tuxedo that cost more than Summer's annual rent. He swirled a glass of scotch, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was finally recognizing his genius. "It's about positioning, Marcus," Gerald said, his voice booming loud enough to ensure the nearby hospital donors could hear him. He turned to Marcus Whitfield, who stood with a glass of sparkling water, his expression unreadable. "The consulting work I've done for the Whitfield Group over the last decade, well, the results speak for themselves. That quarterly retainer has been put to very good use." Marcus tilted his head, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "The payments have certainly been consistent, Gerald. I've always made sure they were delivered on time. And I appreciate the discretion," Gerald added, leaning in with a conspiratorial wink. "Family business is best kept behind closed doors, wouldn't you agree?" A few feet away, Linda Patterson was busy holding court with a group of socialites, her fingers draped in diamonds that caught the light with every theatrical gesture. Beside her, Brianna checked her reflection in her phone's screen, her thumb flying across the glass as she uploaded a live stream. "Can you believe she's actually coming?" Brianna whispered to her mother, her lip curling in a sneer. "I saw her name on the guest list. She's probably going to try and corner Mr. Whitfield for a donation to her little ICU ward." "Let her try," Linda replied, her voice dripping with a cold, refined malice. "She'll only embarrass herself. She doesn't have the breeding for a room like this. A nurse in a ballroom is like a sparrow in a jewelry box, conspicuous and entirely out of place." The heavy brass doors at the end of the hall swung open, and the ambient chatter of the room dipped for a fraction of a second. Summer Patterson stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing scrubs, and she wasn't wearing the tired, defeated expression Gerald had tried so hard to beat into her. She wore a navy blue silk gown that moved like water against her ankles, her hair swept up in a style that emphasized the sharp, elegant line of her jaw. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the owner of the building. Gerald's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. He watched her approach, his face flushing a deep, angry purple. "What is she doing here?" he hissed, stepping forward to intercept her before she could reach the center of the room. "Summer," he barked, his voice a low, vibrating growl as he caught her by the elbow. "This isn't a hospital cafeteria. You've had your little moment of rebellion, but this is a professional event. Leave now before I have security escort you out for trespassing." Summer didn't flinch. She didn't even pull her arm away. She simply looked down at his hand, then up at his eyes with a terrifyingly calm smile. "Trespassing, Gerald? That's a bold word to use in a house built on someone else's money." "You're delusional," he snapped, his eyes darting around to see if anyone was watching. "You've always been ungrateful, but this is a new low. You're an embarrassment. Look at you, trying to play dress-up in a room full of people who actually matter." "I think the people in this room matter very much," Summer said, her voice clear and steady. She looked past him to Marcus, who had moved closer, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. "Especially when they realize where their consulting fees have actually been going." Linda joined her husband's side, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "Summer, dear, stop this nonsense. You're making a scene. We've spent 10 years trying to protect you from your own failures. Don't make us regret our charity in front of the board." "Charity?" Summer let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Is that what you call it? Aunt Dorothy is already in the lounge, Linda. She brought the ledgers. The ones you thought were lost in the move 5 years ago." Linda's face didn't just pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray. Her hand went to the pearls at her throat, her fingers trembling. Dorothy is a confused old woman. Nobody will listen to her. They won't have to listen, Summer replied, her voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. They can just read. The payments Marcus sent every month weren't for Gerald's advice. They were marked for the care and education of the Whitfield heir, my father's daughter. And yet, I remember working double shifts to pay for my own nursing school while you were buying a new Lexus. Gerald's breathing was coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the exit. You have no proof of that. Those records are private. Not anymore, a new voice interrupted. Aunt Dorothy stepped out from behind a floral arrangement, clutching a faded manila envelope to her chest. Her eyes were bright with a decade's worth of suppressed truth. I kept everything, Gerald. Every deposit slip, every diverted transfer. I couldn't let you keep doing it to her. The room had gone dangerously quiet. The board members, the donors, and the socialites were all turning, their curiosity piqued by the raw tension radiating from the center of the floor. Brianna's phone was still up, the red live icon blinking as she captured her father's crumbling facade for her thousands of followers. Marcus Whitfield stepped forward, his presence commanding the space. He looked at Gerald, then at the envelope in Dorothy's hand. I think it's time we moved this conversation to the boardroom, Marcus said, his voice like a gavel strike. The gala can continue without the guest of honor. Marcus, wait, Gerald stammered, his bravado dissolving into a pathetic, sweaty desperation. There's an explanation. This is just a misunderstanding between family. We aren't family, Gerald, Marcus said, his eyes turning to Summer with a look of profound, aching pride. And the board is waiting. Summer, would you care to lead the way? Summer nodded, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. She didn't look back at the man who had spent a decade trying to erase her. She walked toward the boardroom doors, the weight of the secret finally shifting from her shoulders to the people who deserved to carry it. Behind her, she could hear the frantic, hushed whispers of the crowd and the sound of Gerald's glass hitting the floor, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The countdown was over. The storm had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung shut with a finality that echoed like a gavel. Summer felt the cool, sterile air of the executive suite press against her skin, a sharp contrast to the humid, sweat-scented desperation Gerald Patterson had radiated downstairs. He followed them in, flanked by Linda and Brianna, their faces a frantic mask of forced composure. They looked like intruders in a space they had once claimed to rule, their expensive perfume and designer labels suddenly smelling of decay in the face of the clinical, high-stakes atmosphere. The board members sat in high-backed leather chairs, their faces unreadable. Marcus Whitfield took his seat at the head of the table, but he didn't speak. He simply gestured toward the podium where a laptop sat, its screen glowing like a beacon of impending judgment. Summer stepped forward. Her heels didn't click on the thick carpet. She moved with a silent, predatory grace that seemed to unnerve her adoptive father more than any shouting could. This is a farce, he spat, his voice cracking as he gripped the back of a chair. Marcus, you can't let this girl, this nurse, dictate the future of this institution. She's a thief. She's been siphoning information. Linda nodded vigorously, her hand clutching her designer clutch so hard her knuckles were white. She's always been ungrateful, she added, her voice a sharp, jagged edge. We took her in, and this is how she repays us, with lies and theater. Summer didn't look at them. She tapped a key. The projector hummed, and a series of documents filled the far wall. Aunt Dorothy's ledger was there, digitized and undeniable. Bank transfers from the hospital's charity fund to Gerald's private offshore accounts blinked in high definition. Every dollar stolen from patient care was laid bare in black and white. But that wasn't the killing blow. She swiped the screen, and a legal deed appeared. The Whitfield Medical Group's charter, recently amended and stamped with the state's highest seal. The color didn't just leave Gerald's face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a gray, waxy translucence. His eyes, usually narrowed with calculated malice, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around the pupils. His jaw slackened, his bottom lip trembling as he stared at the signature at the bottom of the deed. He looked like a man watching his own execution in slow motion. His chest hitched in shallow, ragged bursts, and he reached out a hand as if to physically tear the image from the wall, but his fingers only clawed at empty air. His skin took on a sickly, mottled hue, and a fine sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, matting his thinning hair. He looked small. For the first time in her life, she realized he wasn't a giant. He was just a parasite that had run out of a host. His mouth worked soundlessly, like a fish gasping on a dry deck, his throat bobbing as he tried to swallow a truth that was far too large to go down. Beside him, Linda's face had frozen into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She wasn't looking at the money. She was looking at Summer, finally seeing the woman she had tried to bury. Dr. Rebecca Chen stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a screech that set everyone's teeth on edge. She looked at the figures on the screen, then at the man she had trusted for a decade, with a disgust so profound it was physical. Two other board members whispered harshly, one of them already pulling out a phone to call the authorities. Brianna, realizing the cameras she usually loved weren't here to save her, shrank back against the wall, her influencer facade crumbling into a look of pure, animalistic fear. "You spent 10 years telling me I was nothing," Summer said. Her voice was low, steady, and chilled to the bone. "You told me I didn't belong in this world. You were right. I don't belong in your world of theft and shadows." She paused, meeting his hollow gaze. "Because I own this one. Marcus isn't just the owner. He's my father. And as of 5 minutes ago, he has transferred his controlling interest to me. You aren't just fired, Gerald. You're being sued for every cent you stole, and I've already signed the order to freeze your personal assets. You have nothing." She didn't wait for his scream. She didn't stay to watch her adoptive mother collapse into a chair or her sister start to sob. She turned to Marcus, gave him a small, weary nod, and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear him finally finding his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched wail of denial that was cut short by the arrival of security. She stepped out into the hall, the weight of the past decade finally lifting, replaced by the cold, clear air of the future. The reckoning had begun, and there was no going back. The silence in the executive suite didn't just linger, it suffocated. Summer Patterson stood by the massive mahogany table, her shadow long and sharp against the plush carpet. She didn't look like the charity case they had spent a decade belittling. She looked like the architect of their ruin. Gerald Patterson finally found his breath, though it came out as a ragged, wet sound. "You're bluffing," he hissed, his voice cracking like dry timber. He lunged forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "This is a stunt, a pathetic, desperate stunt by a girl who couldn't handle being a nobody. You think Marcus can just hand over a legacy? I built my reputation in this city. I am the face of this board." "You were the parasite of this board, Gerald," Marcus Whitfield corrected, his voice like grinding stone. He stepped beside his daughter, his presence radiating a quiet, lethal authority. "And the face of this board is about to be printed on an arrest warrant." The door to the boardroom swung open with a heavy, deliberate thud. Dr. Rebecca Chen entered first, her white coat a stark contrast to the dark suits in the room. She wasn't alone. Behind her walked a woman whose presence caused Linda Patterson to let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Aunt Dorothy moved slowly, the rhythmic, metallic asterisk clack-clack of her orthopedic cane echoing off the glass walls. The scent of old lavender and peppermint followed her, a sharp deviation from the expensive, cloying perfumes that usually filled the room. In her gnarled hands, she clutched a battered, accordion-style leather folder. "I told you, Linda," Dorothy said, her voice trembling but clear. "I told you that blood would eventually demand the truth. You thought I burned the ledgers. You thought I was too senile to remember where the original trust documents were hidden." Gerald's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The deep, arrogant flush of his cheeks curdled into a sickly, translucent gray, making the burst capillaries around his nose stand out like jagged lightning. His left eyelid began a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't control, while his jaw slackened, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that revealed the gold fillings he usually flashed in smug smiles. The sweat didn't just bead on his forehead. It erupted, drenching his silk collar until the fabric clung to his throat like a noose. His shoulders, once squared with the unearned confidence of a king, slumped forward, his entire frame appearing to shrink as the air left his lungs in a series of wet, wheezing gasps. He looked less like a businessman and more like a man watching his own execution. "The police are downstairs, Gerald," Dr. Rebecca Chen said, her eyes devoid of professional warmth. "The hospital's internal audit team has already flagged the $12 million you funneled through the dummy pharmaceutical accounts. Every signature, every timestamp, it's all there. You didn't just steal from the hospital. You stole from the patients Summer has been saving while you were busy buying beach houses." The shift in the room was instantaneous and visceral. Brianna Patterson, who had been filming the confrontation for her followers just minutes ago, suddenly dropped her phone. The screen shattered against the hardwood, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. She looked at her father, then at Summer, and took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from the man she had championed. "I didn't know," Brianna stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "Summer, I swear, I had no idea he was doing any of that. He told me it was all legal. He told me you were the one trying to take advantage of us." "Save it, Brianna," Summer said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. She didn't even look at her sister. Her gaze remained locked on the man who had tried to erase her. "You didn't care where the money came from as long as your followers liked the photos of the lifestyle it bought you." Linda Patterson collapsed into one of the leather chairs, her manicured hands covering her face. "We were a family," she wailed, the sound hollow and performative. "Summer, how could you do this to your own mother?" "You were never my mother, Linda," she replied, the words tasting like iron. "You were a jailer who collected a paycheck from my biological father while telling me I was a burden. You didn't just hide my identity, you tried to kill my spirit. But you forgot one thing." Summer leaned over the table, her face inches from Gerald's. He flinched, the scent of his panicked sweat mixing with the ozone of the office printer. "You told me I was nothing," she whispered, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But nothing is exactly what I'm leaving you with." Two uniformed officers stepped into the room, their heavy boots thudding with a finality that ended all debate. They didn't go for Summer. They walked straight to the head of the table. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was a crisp, metallic snap that seemed to break the last of Gerald's resolve. He didn't fight. He didn't even look up as they hauled him out of the chair. Summer didn't watch them lead him away. She didn't stay to hear Linda's hysterical pleas or Brianna's frantic attempts to negotiate. She turned toward the large floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the hospital campus she now owned. The weight of the folder in her hand felt light now. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. She felt the cold, polished brass of the door handle as she turned to leave the boardroom for the last time. She didn't need to stay for the scramble. She didn't need to watch the rats jump from the sinking ship. "I'm more than okay," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I'm finished." She walked out into the hallway, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic victory against the marble. Behind her, the Empire was screaming. Ahead of her, for the first time in 25 years, there was only silence. She had given them exactly what they deserved, the truth and the consequences of it. As the elevator doors slid shut, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. The sleeping lion wasn't just awake, she was finally free. 6 months had passed since the glass walls of the Patterson Empire had shattered, and the shards were still being swept into the dustbin of local history. Summer Patterson stood in the center of the newly renovated atrium of the Whitfield Hayes Memorial Wing, the air smelling of fresh white lilies and expensive floor wax. She adjusted the lapel of her charcoal gray blazer, feeling the weight of the silver scissors in her hand. This wasn't just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a burial of the lies that had defined her life for 25 years. Dr. Rebecca Chen approached her with a warm, professional smile, her heels clicking softly against the pristine marble. She held a clipboard to her chest, looking over the gathered crowd of donors and city officials. "The staff is already calling it the summer wing," the director noted, her voice low and full of genuine respect. "They haven't forgotten who stood up for them when the board was trying to gut the pension fund. You've done more for this hospital in half a year than the previous administration did in a decade." Summer offered a modest nod, though her eyes drifted to the empty space where the old board portraits used to hang. "I just wanted the truth to be the foundation of the building, Rebecca. Everything else was built on sand." A hand settled gently on Summer's shoulder, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Marcus Whitfield. He looked younger than he had 6 months ago, the shadow of grief and uncertainty replaced by a quiet paternal pride. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I received the final update from the legal team this morning. The forensic audit is complete." Summer felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "And Gerald?" "The bank seized the estate 3 weeks ago," Marcus said, his tone devoid of pity. "Gerald Patterson tried to file for a stay of execution, claiming he was a victim of corporate sabotage, but Aunt Dorothy's testimony was the final nail. The judge didn't just dismiss his claim, he referred the embezzlement evidence to the district attorney. Gerald is currently living in a 1-bedroom rental on the edge of the industrial district, waiting for an indictment that's scheduled for Tuesday." The image of Gerald, once so obsessed with the thread count of his sheets and the vintage of his wine, trapped in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, brought a cold sense of justice to Summer's heart. He had spent his life stepping on others to feel tall, and now the world was looking down on him. "And Linda?" Summer asked, the word still feeling like a bruise. "She's back in the town she grew up in," Marcus replied. "Working at a small boutique. Aunt Dorothy says she doesn't go out much." The social circles she spent 30 years cultivating dropped her the moment the fraud went public. As for Brianna, her redemption documentary was pulled by the streaming service last month. Her follower count is gone, and the brands she spent her life serving have scrubbed her name from their registries. She's learning that when you build a life on clout, you disappear when the light goes out. Summer looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of people who had once looked through her as if she were invisible. Now, they waited for her signal to begin the future. She felt a brief, sharp pang of loss, not for the people the Pattersons were, but for the family she had once wished they could be. She had traded a lifetime of comfortable lies for a cold, hard truth. She was the daughter of Catherine Hayes, a woman who had been erased by greed, and now she was the steward of her mother's legacy. It was a victory, but it was a lonely one. "Are you ready?" Dr. Rebecca Chen asked, gesturing toward the velvet ribbon stretched across the entrance of the intensive care unit. Summer stepped forward, the cameras flashing like distant lightning. She could almost feel the phantom weight of the navy blue dress she had worn during her final confrontation in the boardroom. She had been a nurse then, a girl looking for answers. Now, she was the woman who had provided them. She gripped the cold metal of the scissors and felt the eyes of the city on her. She thought of Gerald sitting in his dark apartment, staring at a phone that would never ring with an invitation again. She thought of Linda, finally forced to face the reflection of the woman she had become. With a single, decisive snip, the silk ribbon fell away. The applause was deafening, a roar of validation that filled the high ceilings of the atrium. Summer smiled for the cameras, her expression serene and untouchable. She had given them exactly what they deserved, the consequences of their own choices. As she walked through the doors of the new wing, Marcus at her side and the ghost of her mother in her heart, Summer didn't look back. The empire was gone, the lion was satisfied, and for the first time in her life, the silence ahead of her didn't feel like a secret. It felt like peace. She reached out and touched the cold brass of the commemorative plaque bearing her mother's name. The metal was solid, real, and finally, permanently, home.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.